And I think we've enjoyed looking at Nehemiah the past couple of weeks. We've learned a lot, and to just kind of refresh, what Nehemiah had gone through. He's had quite the experience. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. He gets news that Jerusalem has been destroyed, and that it's not just that the city has been destroyed, it's that everything is just in complete ruins. The people, the city, the condition of the wall, everything that's going on, it is just an absolute mess. And when he gets this news, it just really was like the big punch to the gut, and it put him down. He wept and he fasted and he prayed. And we read that this went on for almost a period of 4 months. And think about that. I mean, how hard it must have hit him if he spent 4 months weeping and fasting and praying. And I think we all know, we can all think of a loss that we've experienced. You don't just necessarily come back from that. You don't always just bounce back when it is a big loss, when it's something that really hurts. And so here Nehemiah this is something that really hurt. It really put him down, and he doesn't get angry. He doesn't get bitter. He doesn't plot revenge, which sometimes seems really good. Instead, he draws on his faith. He draws closer to God. And so as we look at Nehemiah, his faith really lasts throughout this entire section. He really draws on his relationship with God, and then it gives him courage. Because one day, after 4 months of fasting and praying and weeping, he can no longer hold it back, and he is sad in the king's presence. And the king says, "What is wrong?" And Nehemiah begins to share. And he begins to lay out, he says, "Why wouldn't I be upset? Wouldn't you be upset if your homeland, the place where your ancestors are buried, lied in ruins? And everything that you held on to, everything that you drew from, was completely destroyed." In that moment, Nehemiah exhibits extreme courage to tell the king of what was going on in his life. Because his job wasn't to bear his personal baggage to the king. It was to do his work, to bring the cup to the king, and to help him to do that. And so Nehemiah is extremely courageous. And as we looked at this a few weeks ago, part of the reason that Nehemiah had so much courage is that prior to this, the king had said, no one will rebuild this city because there have been problems there. They didn't pay their taxes that they're supposed to, and they've actually been destructive towards other nations. They've been kind of defiant. And so what an amount of courage it takes. And we look at this, we read this story, and we remember we can obviously see God at work, because not only does the king say, you can go and rebuild the city, but the king also says, when Nehemiah asks, yes to giving him letters for safe passage. And then Nehemiah, you've really got to give props to Nehemiah here, because he steps up and he says, "King, if it pleases you, would you give me the materials that I need out of your forest to rebuild the city?" And so this amazing amount of courage. So Nehemiah is faithful, he is courageous, and as soon as he arrives in Jerusalem, and this starts in chapter 2, he begins to experience opposition. Let's look at just Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 real quick, because this is going to come back. We read Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. "Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters." This is the letters that are giving him safe passage. This is the letters that are going to let him take the materials out of the king's forest. "Now the king had sent officers of the army and cavalry with me, and when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel." And hang on to that someone, because here we are, the people of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, they were there. There weren't many people there, and it displeased these two people that someone actually cared about the people of Israel. That's where the opposition begins. It begins with just a little bit of an annoyance, and then it moves to intimidation, it moves to ridicule, it moves to condemnation. Think about that. How well do we often do in the face of opposition? I mean, we do not wake up in the morning and say, "You know what? I'd really like my day to be difficult today. I would really like to have problem after problem. God, if you can work that out, Make sure that I have people who intimidate me, who just ridicule me, who pick on me. We never say that. In fact, what do we say? God, remove the obstacles. Make my day smooth. Help me to get through this day. And if you do that, then I will know that you were present. Now, we have the benefit of reading Nehemiah's memoir. We know from start to finish that God is actively involved. And it would be very logical to think that if God is involved, then Nehemiah shouldn't have any problems. And that if he is having problems, well, then maybe something's wrong. Isn't that what we would tend to think? Yeah, we tend to think that if I have problems, then I clearly have done something wrong. And yet God is at work in this, and Nehemiah still has problems. Just because we have problems does not mean that God is not at work. I like all of those triple negatives there. We can have problems, and God can still work. How about that? And that's what we see so evident in Nehemiah. So Nehemiah works through the problems, he endures the opposition, he motivates the people, and along the process, the intimidation gets so bad, the opposition gets so bad that he actually has his workers working with one hand and carrying weapons with the other. Think about how you have to motivate people to do that. I worked with a guy when I did contracting who probably would not be able to do this. He had remarkable skills with one hand. He could do almost anything with one hand, the other hand stayed in his pocket. He never did a two-handed project in the entire time that I worked with him. If he could do it with one hand, it was great. If he needed two, it was a struggle. And so here these workers are for Nehemiah. They do their work with one hand, they carry their weapon with the other. And even in that, they don't give up. And then we get this amazing verse, Nehemiah chapter 6, which is actually where we're going to be tonight. Nehemiah chapter 6, and it's 2 verses, 15 and 16. And I think most of us will catch what is the obvious important part here. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. The wall was finished. Think about this. This is absolutely amazing. They endure opposition. The king initially, years ago, didn't want this to happen. They've had so much opposition from people that the workers have had to work with one hand and have a weapon in the other. And they managed to finish the wall in 52 days. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? I have a number of projects that have exceeded 52 days in my house. In fact, some of them I don't even want to recount how long I've been working on this exact project. And 52 days, the entire wall is finished. It's remarkable. It's another sign that God was at work in the midst of what Nehemiah was doing. In fact, it wasn't that God had blessed what Nehemiah was doing. It was that God had already blessed it and called Nehemiah to serve in it. And so as we look at this, I see this remarkable ratio. How long did Nehemiah fast and pray and weep for the city of Jerusalem? Almost 4 months. How long did it take to complete it? Around 2. See, so often we want to do the exact opposite. We want to work harder. We've got a big project, so we need to work more hours, right? We've got this amazing task at hand, and we want to work hard so that it gets done. It's a very noble way to approach it, and we assume that if we work 70, 80 hours a week, that we can get it done if we just keep working harder. 10-hour days, 12-hour days. And yet what we learned from Nehemiah is that this amazing task was accomplished in an unheard of time frame, and it was half as much as Nehemiah prayed. When I started into ministry, I was given advice from some older ministers, and they all try to tell you what to do when you're young, and you're like, oh, I got this. But some of them have really stuck. And one of them was one particular minister, and he kept coming back and he said, Jamie, I get more done in 2 hours of prayer than I do working all day. And I thought to myself, 2 hours of prayer? What do you talk about with God? Think about that. I get more done in my time with prayer than I do working all day. Over the years, I would love to tell you that I've prayed 2 hours every day. Can't say that. But I can tell you that the times that I've spent more time in prayer, those days have been more productive than the times I've spent less time in prayer. And so this passage, this concept that we learn in Nehemiah of spending time in prayer and being able to accomplish things that don't make sense, I've seen it happen. Now, we actually saw it happen this summer. If you remember back to our mission trip, this summer we did this amazing local mission trip. We stayed right here. We helped a family put new floor joists underneath their home. This was a job that some contractors had turned down. One contractor actually told them they should just burn the house down. It wasn't worth fixing. It was that big of a job. And so when we heard about this job, I looked at it and I thought, man, this is big. There is no way we can do this. And so normally we tell the families we will finish in a week. We will have this done in a week, and because we don't want it to go on and on. And there's good motivation for it to finish in the week, because if it finishes after a week, everybody else goes back to work, and I'm the one that's still working at it. So we try to finish within that week time span. And I told the family there's no guarantee that we're going to get this done in a week. I'll tell you what, we'll come here for a week, we will work, and we'll do what we can. Because it was such a big job. But the leadership team had been praying about the mission trip all year long. From the time that we knew that we were having it, the date set, until it actually commenced. The leadership team had been praying, and I know that there were several others that were praying. And I was amazed when we set the last floor joists in place Thursday afternoon. We finished 2 days early. Couldn't believe what had happened. And so I'm convinced that what Nehemiah experienced, we all have the opportunity to experience when the project that we're doing is absolutely covered in prayer. When we try to do it on our own, it can be hard, it can be difficult, and it can be frustrating. When we do it with God, there's no guarantee that it will be easy, that we won't have any opposition, but yet something miraculous happens when God is in the midst of it, rather than when we work out of our own power. So as we look at this, the wall was finished in 52 days. And then something else happens here in verse 16. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Do you remember the verse that I read in chapter 2? We started out with two people who were annoyed that someone cared about God, that someone cared about God's people. Two people who were just slightly bothered that someone cared about the people of Israel. And as this wall is completed, as the stories go out to all of the nations, imagine what would happen if we built a wall right around the city of Meadville in 52 days. Everybody would be talking, right? Because, man, can you believe that? There's never been a wall there. The wall was destroyed. I can't believe that they're rebuilding that. And then to accomplish it in such a miraculous time frame, that word would travel. And it did travel in Nehemiah's day. It traveled to all of their enemies. It traveled to all of the surrounding nations. Word spreads fast. Bad news spreads faster, right? It's amazing how that happens. But when you see something miraculous, that seems to pass pretty quick too. And so all of their enemies, all of the nations around them, are now aware that the wall has been rebuilt. And they are terrified. Not because the wall was rebuilt, right? They're not afraid because the wall was rebuilt. They're afraid because they see that the wall was rebuilt within a time span that doesn't seem possible. And they know that the only way that can happen is if the God of Israel was involved. And who is this God that makes the impossible possible? Who is this God that took something that had been in ruins, that had been destroyed for years? That the same king had said, we will not rebuild this, and now rebuilds it and actually provides the materials. Who is this God that can change people and change things? And you better believe they were afraid. I look at this, and it is remarkable that people who weren't even connected with Israel's God saw God's activity in the rebuilding of the wall. And I look at the application of this. Where does this apply to the church? How does this apply to the church? What can the church do with this? Because it's evident that when God works, people see it. Right? When God is in the midst of things, people see it. When the church just works hard, I think it's chalked up to the church just working hard, to people working hard. Hey, lots of people work hard. Lots of people put in lots of hours. But when God is at work, it seems to change the dynamics of the way the work progresses. It's the story that we experienced in the mission trip. It's the story that we read in Nehemiah. And as the wall is rebuilt, you would think that would be the end of the story, right? The wall's rebuilt, everything is good. But when we read chapter 7, verse 4, just flip to the next page there, Nehemiah 7, verse 4, we read that the city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been built. So there was this amazing wall that was rebuilt. The city of God, Jerusalem, the walls had been finished in an amazing time, and yet there was something missing. What was missing? The people, right? It was wide, it was large, but there was nobody there. It's scary to be in a place by yourself that's that big, isn't it? It's scary to walk in and to not have anybody there. On the other hand, well, we'll get there in just a second. It's scary to walk into a place and nobody be there. And so here they are. There's this renewal that's about to take place. The wall has been finished, and all of a sudden the invitation goes out. To anyone who is here, to anyone who has ancestors here, come home. And chapter 7 is filled with this list of everyone who returns to Jerusalem. And so we move in a very short time span from the city being in complete ruins and being empty to the city being rebuilt and empty to the city being rebuilt and full. And that seems like a really good place to end the story, doesn't it? The city's rebuilt. The city is full. Yay, God, we're good. Have you ever been to a crowded restaurant? Have you ever been to a restaurant that was just absolutely packed and you had to wait and wait and wait to get your food? I've had this happen a number of times. And the first impression when you walk into a really full restaurant or a really full store or a really full place is, this must be good, right? Because there's lots of people here. And so we have that assumption that if there are a lot of people in a place, that it must be good. Because there's excitement, there's a buzz, there's kids making noise, there's adults talking, there's the shuffle of people walking up and down the street and just moving around. And a crowd is relatively noisy. Even if it's not like yelling, like football game kind of crowd, just a crowd of people can make a fair amount of noise just moving around and filling that space. And so there is this idea that if something is full and packed with people, it must be good. But I have been to restaurants where it was full and packed with people, and when I ordered my meal, it wasn't so good. And the service wasn't so good. Has that happened to anybody else? And so I think Ezra and Nehemiah, they realized something really important here, because what they're going to do is they're not going to say the story is over. They're going to say, wait a minute. Just because the city is full doesn't mean it's good. What we need to do is take the people back to connect with God. And so Ezra's going to step up here. Nehemiah's portion is kind of going to step to the side. Ezra's going to step up and he's going to read the law to the people. And he's going to help the people understand that what happened here was just the beginning. It wasn't about the wall being rebuilt. It wasn't about the city being filled. It was about the people coming back and renewing their commitment with God. And what happens there is life-changing. when the people renew their commitment to God, they renew their covenant to God, their hearts and their lives are changed. I look at this, and it reminds us that great things can happen. But real renewal, lasting renewal, hopefully happens in the heart of the people. And there needs to be a renewal in the covenant between the people and God. And interestingly enough, it's not God who needs to renew the covenant, is it? Because as we've read this story, hasn't God been at work the entire time? God has laid the groundwork in preparing Nehemiah. Nehemiah is in a place where he is close to the king, where he has a good relationship. Nehemiah's faith is strong. He trusts in God. Nehemiah trusts in God to the point that he's willing to risk his life to share what is really in his heart. God is at work in the king as he changes his heart and says, we're going to go from not rebuilding this to rebuilding this. I'm going to send my cupbearer to oversee this. I'm going to give letters for safe travel. I'm going to give letters to support the materials that they need. And then we have the people who rise up. They build the wall in an amazingly short time span. It's not God who needed the covenant to be renewed. It was the people. See, the people of Israel have a history that I think may sound familiar. And here's my summary of it. God and people are close. We can look at that. We can find that with the Israelites and God. We can find times that they were really close. And then the people become comfortable and slowly begin to drift. One of my favorite examples of this in Scripture is the Israelites being led out of slavery in Egypt. And they follow the fire by night and the smoke by day. And that is God's presence leading them out. And as they get there, they start to say, you know what, Moses? We're not holy enough to be in God's presence. Why don't you go do it for us? And this drift begins to occur, even though they had witnessed God do something amazing. The people become comfortable. They begin to drift away. And the drift continues to increase until a problem arises. And then all of a sudden, oh God, where have you gone? Now maybe, does that ever sound familiar in our life? It sounds familiar in my life. I'm not proud to admit that. But it is so easy to get to the place where God, we're close. And then we begin to drift because things are going well. And then a problem happens and we run back to God. One of the biggest things that I try to help people remember is that covenant or commitment is not based on feelings. So often our spiritual walk is determined by how we're feeling. If we're scared, we run to God. If we're pretty relaxed, we don't. And when our feelings dictate our walk with God, we end up with this roller coaster ride. We end up close to God one moment, far away in the next, and then someday we say, I don't even feel God being close. Our feelings shouldn't dictate our walk with God. That's not what commitment is about. It's not what covenant is about. Covenant is about realizing that the God who loves you has always loved you, will always love you, and that all we have to do is choose to walk with him every day. But that's hard work. And as we put it out there, it truly is. As we read this story, there's so much more we could do with this. We took a story of Nehemiah, we covered it in 4 weeks. I think we could have easily doubled that time. But as we look at this story, I want you to remember that God is at work. That God loves you right where you are. That God has not changed in his love for you. And if you're feeling distant, it is really easy to renew that covenant with God. It's not our feelings that determine how close we are. It's the choices that we make to spend time in prayer, to spend time reading, to spend time walking in the way that we know God wants us to walk. And so as we close tonight, I really want you to take an inventory of where you're at. If you are far from God, or you feel far from God, ask God to bring you back. Ask God to renew that covenant in your life. Not because God needs it renewed, but sometimes we need it renewed, right? Sometimes we need to be reminded that God is at work. And if you're feeling close to God, I encourage you not to become complacent. Ask God to help you stay vigilant in your walk with him so that you don't get to the point where you feel complacent and you begin to drift. Because when we begin to drift, inevitably we will wind up feeling far from God. And that's not where we want to be. It's not the place where God wants us to be. I'm just going to close in prayer tonight. I'm going to ask the praise team to come back up. And as we respond with amazing grace, I'm going to give you time to pray, right where you are. And just allow God to move and to work so that in all things, he can be glorified. Let's pray. Dear God, we just thank you for this time together. God, we thank you for this evening and just the opportunity to worship you. God, I just pray that you will help us to not be complacent. God, I pray that you will help us to just be so sincere in our walk with you, that we trust you every single day, that we come to you whether we feel like it or not, and that God, when we realize that there are projects at hand, we spend twice as much time in prayer as we do working on the project. God, help us to remember that you are always with us, that you always love us, and that, God, you want to lead us to a place that we have never been before. Thank you for this evening.